So welcome everyone to today's talk. It's about simple tricks to drop some weight and tone up, but actually with a main focus on how to also to do that while supporting your health and hormones and longevity. Because a lot of you have probably, if you landed up here today, you've probably tried some diets and you're confused with what's right. You maybe tried some fad diets, they didn't work, or they did work, and then you just fell off the wagon because they're too restrictive or not healthy in the long run. So today I will actually be talking about how can we support our hormones and health so that we have a strong metabolism, and then the weight loss and the toning up is just a welcome side effect rather than looking at the other way around. And that way we also, by supporting our hormones and health, we then also live longer and healthier and happier rather than constantly being on that roller coaster of trying to lose weight, and then that might mess with our metabolism and slow it down, and then it might mess with our mood and our sleep, all these other factors. So today we'll talk about how can we actually optimize our hormones so that all of that works better. And also we'll look at what are underlying factors that might be messing with these hormones and our metabolism. So this is, I always like to use this as a starting point, this little graphic with these different shapes, apples and pears and potatoes. A lot of people can relate to that often. We won't dive into, let's say, the specifics today, but we will be talking about what the different body shapes mean from a hormonal perspective and what underlying triggers are. And there's often an overlap. So it's not that one person's just the one type and the other person is only the other. It's often an overlap, but they have specific underlying factors and hormonal imbalances that can contribute to that weight just not wanting to budge. And then we'll talk about what you can do in a day-to-day starting tomorrow to support these. Okay, so a little bit before we get started properly, what is functional medicine? What's the approach that we will be taking today? And functional medicine is a little bit in between normal medicine, a nutritionist, and a naturopath. So instead of, let's say, like a nutritionist or a health coach saying you need to eat some more vegetables or get some more sleep, which a lot of us know, or a naturopath saying let's try some herbs, or the doctor saying let's do these medications, functional medicine actually connects it and says, okay, let's look at some underlying, let's look at blood work, let's look at your gut health, let's look at what are your nutrients, and then connect it with the newest research and the newest science and say, okay, what can we make specifically for you? What are the underlying factors that are really science-backed, that are not just some kind of something that someone has said somewhere on the internet, but actually science-based, but is very specific to your biology. And it also helps, it's related to your diet and your lifestyle, so you can make changes in your day-to-day rather than taking some drugs that might have long-term side effects. Okay, it also, you might be thinking, how does this all matter? It's all, maybe you think, okay, my mother has issues with her thyroid and I've been having issues with my weight all my life, so maybe there's nothing I can do about it. But there's actually this wonderful and very fascinating field of epigenetics, which is around our genes, where our diet and lifestyle actually decides which genes we turn on or off, as you can see here. So we can actually, by the way we live, we can in a way decide whether our body turns on good genes or it turns on the bad ones, and whether and with our diet and lifestyle and toxins and pollution and other factors like that, we can influence whether our body turns on a gene that is linked to healthy aging, hormone health, weight loss, or whether it turns on the bad ones. And we all have some good and bad ones. Okay, and then the next step, and we'll talk about that very briefly in the end, there's the way I practice is precision health. So I usually like to do some lab testing and then add science-backed tools, like I said, so you can make very specific changes. And I'll just mention at the end what's out there, but today is really all about what can you do even without any testing, some things where you can just go and try without more specifics. Okay, a little bit about myself. I'm Mirthe. I'm a functional medicine practitioner. I have an undergraduate in health, and then I did a postgraduate in functional medicine. I came to that field through my own health journey of Crohn's disease, which is an autoimmune disease where your immune system attacks your gut, and then it's pretty messy and not very fun. But because I had that undergraduate in health and learned how to read research, I found all these papers, and that was 15 years ago, and tried these things where my normal doctor said there's nothing I can do about it. I tried these things that I found in research, and they actually put my autoimmune disease into remission. And so then I went on this search of finding more about it, and eventually found this field of functional medicine, which is actually quite large in the US already, but it's slowly coming over to the UK and Europe as well, and then became a functional medicine practitioner. And so now I see patients, help them take charge of their health, but also still dedicate a whole big part of my time in research, because there's so much wonderful new research coming out every day. Little medical disclaimer before we get started is that all of the information today is not there to diagnose anything. So if you have any symptoms, please do go to your GP and get them checked out, and then come in, and then you can try these things. So if you have symptoms, anything that doesn't feel right, go get them cleared up, that there's not something that we're missing, and then you can adjust these specific things that we're talking about today as an adjunct to what your normal medical doctor would have said. Okay, so the first part of today's session, so we'll be talking about the underlying triggers of why these hormones might not be working, because as if you're like a lot of my patients, you probably have tried a lot of things and you think, why is this not working for me and for my neighbor, my best friend, whoever it is working? So we'll be diving a little bit deeper into the underlying triggers so that you can understand a bit better what might be going on, and then you can make educated choices. So it's not, again, some kind of just some diet that you're falling off soon because it's too complicated or you don't understand why, but that you actually understand why these things are important to do. Okay, so you can become the CEO of your own health once you understand why. Okay, so let's dive into those different shapes, and we'll start with the apple shape. Now, I have a whole online course where I go into a lot of detail into what's all these different shapes, and it's a 4-week course, but today is obviously only an hour, so I'll be just talking about little bits, and I'll dive right in without all the different big explanations. So what I find often with people that come into my practice and then in research confirms it, is that people that have that layer of fat around the waist, that apple shape, where they can't budge even though they might be trying all the right things, it's often linked to insulin and blood sugar issues, inflammation, or cortisol levels. I see this also very often with patients that are quote unquote skinny fat. They have skinny limbs, skinny arms, but then they just have this layer of belly fat that doesn't want to go away. And so they're skinny, but that belly fat is bothering them. And like I said, often that's due to blood sugar, inflammation, or stress levels. And we'll talk about that in a moment a little more, where these are coming from. But what research has shown is that when we are either having insulin problems, blood sugar, or we have inflammation, or we are stressed and have cortisol issues, then our brain actually sends signals to our belly to store fat there instead of storing it around our arms or our legs. So it redistributes the fat from there to the waistline, even though if you're quote unquote skinny. Okay, so today's talk is also a little bit about why this matters in the long run for healthy aging and longevity, well-being. And what research has shown also is that this apple shape is not just maybe a vain concern, but it also has been linked to other issues like PCOS, which is linked to infertility and hormonal acne. It can also be leading to things like perimenopause issues or worsen perimenopause issues. It can contribute to Alzheimer's, to cancers, cardiovascular disease like strokes and heart attacks. So overall, we want to make sure that not just from a vain perspective, wanting to get rid of that belly fat, but actually want to make sure that everything works well inside so that we don't run into these issues down the line. Okay, so where's this insulin for the one that just joined? So we're talking about the apple shape as a starting point, and the apple shape is one of the different body shapes where sometimes people might be skinny, but they have this extra layer of belly fat that just won't budge. And there's 3 reasons for that most commonly. One being insulin resistance, second, inflammation, and third, stress cortisol levels. I always get confused when there are too many people joining in, so here we are. Okay, so where's this insulin resistance coming from? You might have heard of insulin. It's a very important hormone in the body that signals when we're eating something, in particular with sugars or carbs. It opens our cells up so it can actually take that in and use it for energy. Now, if we have a lot of food all the time, if we overeat calories or we overeat sugars, then the body constantly pumps out insulin and eventually the cells stop responding. Even though there's sugar, they say, no, we're not listening to insulin anymore. And when that happens, the brain then starts to accumulate fat around the waistline. So this is something that a lot of people are kind of familiar with. Overeating can often lead to weight gain. But there are other reasons for this insulin resistance. And one of them, wait, let me get to this one. One of them is inflammation. And research shows that inflammation, as just on its own, can redistribute weight to the waistline, but also it makes the body more insulin resistant. So it's kind of a double whammy to contribute to that apple shape, that belly fat around the waistline that is resistant to weight loss often, even if you're trying all these things. And where's this inflammation coming from? And again, I see this quite commonly in my patients. It's a very common concern people come to me with is, so inflammation, a lot of people have heard of. It's kind of a trendy word that's been thrown around in social media nowadays, but there are usually reasons why this is happening. And inflammation in itself is actually a healthy mechanism that helps us survive. Our immune system, when we have an infection, let's say a virus, bacteria, our immune system pumps out inflammation to get rid of that virus, bacteria. Usually that happens a couple days, maybe a little longer if the infection is a little stronger, and then that inflammation kills it off and stops again. However, if that inflammation starts to linger and is a chronic low-grade inflammation, then that starts to cause issues in our gut, in our system. It also starts to degrade our overall health. It contributes to things like Alzheimer's and cancers, anxiety, endometriosis, lots of different factors. But it also leads to that belly fat. Now, where is this low-grade chronic lingering inflammation coming from that we don't want because it messes with our weight and our health? And one of the reasons is if there's a chronic infection. So if the infection for some reason hasn't been gotten rid of properly and it lingers, then the immune system constantly pumps out this low-grade inflammation. And we commonly see that in our gut. Now, again, this is something that people are more aware of these days. You might have heard about the gut microbiome. In our gut here, we have a whole bunch of bacteria, but also different types of fungus. And they're needed to break down foods, to metabolize it, to make certain nutrients, to keep our gut lining nice and healthy. But if there's an overgrowth of bad type of bacteria, then our body pumps out inflammation because it tries to fight it off, but for some reason it's not getting rid of it. Also, if we have problems in the gut and we have bad type of bacteria in there, it starts to make our gut more permeable. They call it leaky gut, but it actually is a thing where our gut lining becomes slightly more permeable and allows foods that are normally healthy, like an almond or an egg, pass into our bloodstream. And then also in the immune system, because it's a different size of if the gut is more permeable, it allows different shapes of that same almond or egg into the bloodstream. And then the immune system says, wait, I don't recognize this. What is this? This must be an invader. Let me pump out inflammation. And then you develop food intolerances, where every time you eat that healthy food, your body pumps out this inflammatory reaction to try and kill it off. But it's obviously not something to kill off. And then you're constantly chronically inflamed and you do whatever you want to do, but the weight won't budge. And you also often have brain fog or joint aches or all these other issues related to inflammation. So those are very common things I see in my patient population. But like I said, research backs it up. Another one, so often bacterial overgrowth in the gut, but also fungal overgrowth. One that people often have heard of is candida, which is a type of fungus. SIBO is an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, where we normally should have most of our bacteria in the different part of the intestine. And SIFO, a lot of people, I just throw these words in because a lot of people might have heard of them, and now I'm trying to make sense of them for you. SIFO is when we have a fungal overgrowth in our small intestine. Again, messing with our digestive system, causing inflammation because the immune system is constantly pumping things out to try and get rid of that. And also, lastly, with that inflammation is that if we're not having the right nutrients to quench inflammation, get rid of it, then our body's also more of in an inflammatory state and contributes to that weight around the waist. And one of the most famous ones, but it is one of the most important ones, is actually omega-3. We need omega-3s get rid of inflammation is called resolution in science, and it helps the body, if there is inflammation, to calm it down. Another reason for that belly fat that I mentioned is cortisol stress. So number one are these blood sugar swings leading to insulin resistance. Number two is inflammation. And number three is cortisol. Now, cortisol, a lot of people, again, have probably heard of it. It's our stress hormone, or one of the stress hormones. And it's actually not all bad. As you can see here, this is 6 a.m. and this is 6 p.m. So this part here is daytime. The blue curve is cortisol and the red curve is melatonin. Now, in a healthy person, the way we evolved and the way it should be, we have a nice spike of cortisol first thing in the morning, and then it should taper off throughout the day so that we can have a nice sleep at night. Melatonin comes up. They kind of balance each other out. If one is high, the other one can't come up in a way. So the problem arises if we are constantly overworked or there's other stressors. If this pattern becomes all messed up, rather than having a nice spike in the morning and then taper off, either we wake up and we have this anticipatory stress and then it's low for the rest of the day, or it's low in the morning when it should be high because our body's actually just dragging itself out of bed, and then we're slowly revving ourselves up, and then all the daytime stresses come in. We may be having tons of coffee, other caffeinated foods, drinks, and then we stay too high for too long, and even in the evening, and that messes with our metabolism and our cortisol and circadian rhythm. Now, as that relates to our weight, research shows that if we either have too high cortisol levels first thing in the morning, oh, again, someone's 1 second, sorry, mute. All the people that join late, I can't mute them properly. Apologies for that. So research shows that if we wake up in the morning and we have this anticipatory stress for the day, if we have too much cortisol right in the morning, then that can lead to obesity and weight gain issues, even if we eat the same types of food as if we weren't stressed out. And on the other side, research also shows that if cortisol is too low in the morning and or stays too high for the rest of the day, later in the day, that also messes with our weight distribution. So again, when this cortisol is either way too high in the morning or too low in the morning, or it stays too high late in the day when we should be getting more relaxed, that's when the brain sends signals to our way to store fat, even if we're eating the same food. See this quite often. So one thing that I want to touch upon as well is that oftentimes people say, well, I don't really feel that stressed. That's actually not that often, but sometimes people have a fairly stress-free life. But there's actually other factors that can act like a stressor on the body, and our brain doesn't really distinguish between real and perceived stress. So it can even be, it can be something that we quote unquote usually classify as stress, work deadlines, fight with a spouse, kids, those kinds of things, financial burden. But it could also be other stressors such as trauma, PTSD, that keeps triggering your stress response. It could be chronic infections in the body, like I mentioned before, with these lingering issues in the gut, candida overgrowth, bacterial overgrowth, food intolerances. They act like a tiger where the body has to run away and be stressed out. Heavy metals, pollution, mold exposure, not enough nutrients, or lack of sleep, they all mimic a tiger that the body has to run off. And then we get into that fight or flight state all the time, and that messes with our metabolism, stores the weight instead of using it. Okay, that was the apple shape. And I could talk about this topic forever, but we're very time limited today. I'm probably going over a little bit anyways. If you have to jump off at 7, please just go to the recording. So the second one that is common is the pear shape. Now, this often has to do with estrogen, progesterone. I more commonly see this in women that have a cycle still, so a monthly period. The apple shape is more common with women that either on the pill and they don't have a cycle because they're suppressing it, or postmenopausally. But like I said, oftentimes these shapes can actually overlap, and it's not that clear cut that one person only has one or the other. So you could be saying, actually, this both I'm still having a cycle and I feel like I have a pear shape, but I also have this apple. So it often overlaps. But most commonly, if people have this pear shape, it means that they have a cellulite around the legs, bigger butt, and they find that part difficult to shift. That can often have to do with estrogen progesterone imbalances. And you can see here we have this menstrual cycle, 28 days if for the ones that have a cycle. And normally here you can see progesterone, and estrogen's the yellow line, progesterone is the blue line, and it should have this nice little up and down throughout the cycle. Now, if in that second part of the cycle, we have too little progesterone, so this progesterone line drops and the estrogen line comes up, then this is something called estrogen dominance that I very regularly see in my patients, and that can then lead to that pear shape. There are other hormonal imbalances as well, but that's just the one that is very common, and that is linked to that pear shape. It also has to do with not just the amount of estrogen that's there, but how the body's breaking it down. We won't go into detail here, but sometimes the body has the right amount of estrogen, but it's breaking it down into a toxic version, and that can also contribute to that pear shape and estrogen dominance symptoms. Now, some of the symptoms, other than that weight around the thighs and the butt, and also maybe cellulite, can be painful periods, fibroids in the breasts or in the ovaries, uterus. It could be endometriosis, it could be anxiety, it could be having issues with conceiving, infertility, even all the way to breast cancers, ovarian cancers. They all have a strong estrogen dominance component. And like I said, it's often not only the estrogen, but also the way it's broken down that can be an issue here. Okay, where is this coming from? In a very short nutshell, oftentimes, if the body is stressed, it, like it was before we looked at that tiger, if the body thinks there's a tiger chasing at us, it thinks it's not safe to make babies. And even if that's not what you want to do, our body's kind of hardwired to do that. So then it actually stops the body from ovulating properly, and then we don't make enough progesterone. So that could be one of the reasons, not enough progesterone to balance out the estrogen. It could also be that we're exposing ourselves to a lot of hormone mimicking substances. They're called endocrine disruptors. Things like drinking out of a plastic coffee takeaway mug every day, or drinking out of plastic bottles, or putting a lot of creams on that are synthetic, and have a lot of the synthetic creams have endocrine disruptors in them. They mimic estrogen, but then the body isn't actually able to break them down properly into the good and protective form, but turns it into that toxic form. Also, excess alcohol can contribute to too much estrogen. Okay. The third shape that we're talking about today, very briefly, is the potato shape. Some of you might relate to that. That's when it's, rather than being around the waist and you have kind of skinny arms and legs, or it's mostly around your thighs and butt, it feels like it's just all over, and you're just feeling heavy and chunky and maybe just kind of overall sluggish. And that's usually, and again, all of this is just a usual oversimplification for today's talk, that's often linked to something called subclinical hypothyroidism. So people have probably heard about thyroid issues. Oftentimes people have gone to their doctors, and the doctors have tested their thyroid hormones and said they're fine. So I'm not talking about that, because then that's, if the thyroid has a problem where your doctor says this is an issue, let's give you thyroid medication, then you're being dealt with. But oftentimes people say, I've gone to the doctor and they said my thyroid is fine, but I Googled all the symptoms with hypothyroidism, low thyroid, and I feel like I have them. So there's something called subclinical hypothyroidism, where you're actually in the normal range, but in the low range, in a low third of it. So your body is just not getting quite enough thyroid hormones to optimally function. And the thyroid is really important for overall metabolism. It helps us speed up the metabolism. It helps us make energy. It helps us burn fuel and calories. So if we have this subclinical hypothyroidism, it can also make us cold, lose hair, slows the metabolism, slows our digestion, so can lead to constipation. slows our mental agility, depression, can contribute to high cholesterol, fertility issues, but then it also can mess with our insulin signaling. So it can then also mess with that or contribute to that apple shape. So that's, in a way, the body's all overlinked all the time. Let me just, someone's put something into the chat. Okay, there we go. The joy of me doing this together alone today. I have to constantly go and go into the chat, see what people are saying so I don't miss someone saying I can't hear you. Okay, so some of the most common reasons, underlying factors, and this again is very oversimplified, for subclinical hypothyroidism can be purely deficiencies in building blocks. I see this all the time. People come in and they just don't actually eat the right foods so to make thyroid. Our thyroid hormones are made from protein and iodine, and a lot of people don't eat enough of both of them. And then to turn the precursor hormone into the active form, we need a lot of different minerals, lots of them, iron and zinc and lots of other wonderful nutrients. And oftentimes they're deficient in those two or on the low end of the ranges. And then they just simply, the body can't make it. It can also be that there's something called Hashimoto's, where there's autoimmune markers that our immune system attacks our thyroid and actually makes it harder for the thyroid to do its job. And there can be underlying triggers for that. And in functional medicine, we look at what are the triggers for any kind of autoimmune issues, for immune system dysregulation. And what I see often, and what again research confirms, are food intolerances are quite common. That if we constantly eat something that the body doesn't like or thinks for some reason it's decided that it is an invader. And a very common one is gluten for the thyroid, but it can be healthy foods like almonds and eggs, like I mentioned before, or even ginger. If you eat that, the immune system constantly pumps out inflammation, and eventually, if that happens all the time, it might start to overreact against itself, and that is kind of, in a very, again, simplified version, what an autoimmune disease is. Can also be from chronic infections that is constantly irritating the immune system, lingering viral issues. I see this quite commonly now since COVID. People post-COVID, post-vaccine or the actual virus, they might have long COVID and there's a lingering viral issue, often a reactivation of other viruses like Epstein-Barr or cytomegalovirus, from glandular fever and things like that were there before and were no issue, and all of a sudden they are triggered from this new infection that hit them, and then the immune system constantly tries and fight it, and then can cause issues with the thyroid. Also, inflammation and blood sugar swings can actually mess with our thyroid. So again, it all is linked back to each other. There's also a few other, I would call them miscellaneous factors that I quite commonly see for people that try, quote unquote, all the right things with their diet, but they just have issues losing weight. And another very common one I see in my female patients is iron, being low in iron and Bs. So iron is actually needed to make red blood cells and transport oxygen to most of our cells, or everywhere in the body really. And if we don't have enough oxygen and iron in the body, then the metabolism slows down. It slows down the thyroid, but it has a lot more wide-reaching effects. It just slows everything down and nothing works as well. It also messes with our satiety, and we get more hungry. It messes with our sleep. So there are lots of kind of knock-on effects how this is affecting our weight. And I often see that being low in the ones that still have a period in particular, or vegan, vegetarian ones. Or I talked about before how an overgrowth of bacteria and fungus can cause inflammation, but also not enough good bacteria. And there's a lot of research out, in particular the last few years, that shows that there's certain types called Akkermansia. This is one that has got a lot of media recently. Because Akkermansia is a healthy gut bacteria that if we eat a varied, healthy diet with fiber and vegetables, our gut usually can make it. And it helps keep the blood sugar more balanced and keeps us more satiated, makes us feel full quicker. It's become a little bit, I guess the people have become a bit more aware of it because of Wegovy and Ozempic, those weight loss drugs, because they both work on a similar mechanism. Obviously, the drugs are a little bit stronger than the Akkermansia bacteria in our gut, but they both work on something called GLP-1, where the drugs they mimic that. They kind of do what maybe this should be doing in our body, where Akkermansia, the bacteria, can help the body excrete it itself to keep us more balanced, satiated, and not be hungry all the time, and keep our blood sugar more balanced, and make our cells more responsive to insulin so that they don't have to store it as fat, but actually utilize it as energy. Yeah. Okay. So what does that all have to do with aging? Just briefly, I've briefly put it into the different sections, but if we have issues with the apple shape, then it also, the insulin issues, inflammation, they can cause issues down the line towards Alzheimer's disease, cancer risk, Parkinson's disease, strokes, heart attacks, all these types of things. The pear shape, when there's estrogen dominance issues or the estrogens being broken down into the wrong type, that can contribute to issues like breast cancers or endometriosis. So it kind of makes us degrade inside and have a reduced quality of life. Thyroid issues I mentioned can contribute to things like high cholesterol levels, which obviously has a knock-on effect on everything. So we don't just want to deal with this because it's a vain concern, but we actually want to deal with this so we can be in charge of our health and stay healthy and stay thriving in the long run. Okay, so this was the first part where I was talking a little bit about the underlying factors, and now I'll be talking about things that you can do starting tonight, tomorrow, simple steps to try and fix those things.